famous rules and laws known in Judaism and shared by other religions as well, and there's probably a reason for that, is often known as the golden rule. What is hateful to you, do not do unto others. And there's a reason that so many cultures share that, because one of the foundations of society is the way that people treat each other. And if we treat each other poorly and attack each other, even if we have reason, even if someone has wronged us, if the moment anybody wrongs us, we attack them, there won't be a society left anymore. There obviously have to be limits on us reacting and getting really vengeance, as it were. But at the same time, there are people out there that are so evil, that have hurt us so badly that we can't just roll over and do nothing. One of my dear friends from years ago, she always used to say, when we were talking about, is there a place for hatred in this world? She always said she doesn't hate anyone except for one of the most hated men in history, Hitler. And she wasn't being facetious. She really meant that. She really tried to orient herself towards all mankind, which she might be annoyed by, not like, but she really tried to limit her hatred. So the question we're going to explore tonight is, what place does hatred and vengeance have in our religion when we want to be loving and build a peaceful society, but also recognize that there are people who wrong us and hurt us and do things that are utterly evil? Is there a magic rule that if somebody's super duper evil, it's okay to hate them, but not hate others? And unfortunately, the reality is, despite what we're going to talk about tonight, which will be, sources and definitions, etc., the reality is hatred is a pretty common trait amongst people, and there's degrees of it. If someone cuts you off in traffic for that moment, maybe it's not hatred, it's anger, but anger often leads to hatred. But then there's true hatred. And unfortunately, hatred often, not always, but often leads to us doing hurtful, damaging things. And more often than not, when we hurt others by gossiping about them, destroying their reputations, or by physically harming them, it also hurts us spiritually, emotionally, and sometimes physically. So hatred and vengeance, we may say, maybe sometimes it's an appropriate tool, but no matter what, even when there might be an appropriate time to hate someone, it still does something negative to our souls. So what place can it have in our tradition? So before we jump into the first source, are there any questions just on that general introduction? I'll pause for a moment, let people kind of percolate, and then we'll jump right into it. Excellent. So Jeremy, I'm going to unmute you first. And something really not only interesting in and of itself, but also makes my job easier, is the text, the verses in the Torah, which are in the book of Vayikra, not this week's Parsha of Vayikra, but coming up very soon. Everything we're talking about tonight is kind of captured in just these few verses. And I believe I'm quite certain, and the rabbis say this too, it's intentional, that the talk about vengeance and love and hatred are all kind of covered in just a few verses. They are all connected in a very powerful way. So Jeremy, if you would take source number 1, please.
You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord.
Everything we're talking about tonight, all of the mitzvot around how we treat other people, and you can see they say it in different things. In the Hebrew, on the right column, it says, lo tisna, do not hate. And by the way, when it said here, kinsfolk, and that's actually a decent translation, it's the word ach, brother. Now, it doesn't mean that sisters are not included, but it means somebody who's family. And not only will we come back to that, but you'll see that familial connection represented or reflected in the rabbis who talk about it. It's not just don't hate a stranger, it's don't hate someone you see as family. Then as soon as it says don't hate, it goes to a positive commandment, which is this word tochacha, which often translates to here reprove or rebuke, but basically when somebody is sinning or doing something bad, you must call them out on it. And we'll find out later why those are connected. Don't actively hate someone, but do point out when somebody's doing something wrong. Then it goes into another major topic for tonight, which is don't take vengeance or bear a grudge. Two different things. Again, so much is in these verses, and the reason is they're all interconnected with our personal relationships. So don't actively take vengeance, I attack someone, like do something, and don't bear a grudge, an internal hatred in your heart. And then the final one, of course, is the famous love your neighbor. And it's ve'ahavta le're'echa, the word not for brother, but neighbor. So there's a lot of different language here for the relationships we have. So here it's not necessarily family. It's the people in your community, kamocha as yourself. And then it ends with Ani Hashem. And there's lots of explanations for when a mitzvah ends with I am the Lord your God. Why? Does it give it extra impact? Is it because we wouldn't, this is a law that, we wouldn't automatically decipher on our own, or the opposite, etc. But this is clearly a powerful set of mitzvot. Don't hate, but also actively go out there. And if you see someone doing something that would make you hate them, call them out on it. Don't commit vengeance, nor carry resentment in your heart. Actively love others, which the rabbis say basically treat them with the same respect and dignity you would have for yourself. Hence the golden rule, what you would do unto other, or what you want people to do to you, treat them the same way. So much to unpack there, and we'll see how the rabbis work on it. This next source here, and then we'll pause after for some questions, again, is the 13th century anonymous work that goes through every mitzvah in the Torah, Sefer HaChinuch. And what you'll actually see is this one source, mitzvah 238, which is don't hate your brother. We're going to see selections from this come up, I think, 3 times in the sources. And the reason is because he covers everything, all the opinions, every different way of approaching the mitzvah. So Elizabeth, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would take this first selection from Sefer HaChinuch, where he kind of unpacks what the mitzvah means to not hate one's brother. And again, it doesn't mean specifically just males, it means your family, and not just your neighbor or a stranger, specifically someone who is your brother connected to you in that familial way. So please, Elizabeth.
Do not hate brothers, do not hate with hatred of the heart any Israelite, as it is stated, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. And the language of Sifra is, I have only said hatred that is in the heart. But when he shows him hatred and the other knows that he is his enemy, he does not violate this negative commandment. However, he does violate, you shall not take vengeance and not bear a grudge. And he likewise violates a positive commandment, as it is stated, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And nonetheless, hatred of the heart is worse than all revealed hatred. And so the Torah especially warns about it.
This is so fascinating. So one of the things that he's exploring here is, why are you saying the same basic idea over and over again? You could just say, don't hate anybody, or you could just say, don't hurt anybody, or you could just say, love everyone and treat them as if you love them. But no, it includes all those. So what he says is that don't hate someone specifically means in your heart, i.e. don't bear resentment. Don't walk around and secretly just despise somebody. And again, unfortunately, many people do this, whether it's a colleague, a boss, or even just someone in their world, and they just keep it to themselves. So if they do that in their heart, that's a mitzvah. But that's not the same as actively doing something to injure them, hurt their reputation. There are all kinds of different negative things do against them. If somebody does that, actively attacks them, then that's the mitzvah of taking vengeance. And at the same time, there's also a positive commandment that they're missing an opportunity of, which is to actively create a positive relationship. So when somebody hates somebody and acts on that hatred, there's multiple commandments, multiple ways that they are harming themselves and the world and the people around them. It's a big deal. What's interesting, though, is the Sefer HaChinuch says of all the things here, like let's say I have an adversary, I have an arch enemy, a nemesis, and everybody knows we hate each other. And every time I see them, I look at them and I say, Newman. I just started watching Seinfeld, so for those who don't know, that's why I'm using that reference. But there are people who actively, outwardly hate each other. That's not good. But hiding that, bottling that hatred up inside, he says, is worse than all of them. Perhaps part of it could be if the hatred is out there and you actually are able to express it, it might be like kind of an outlet. The hatred might be either lessened or others can help mitigate it and help you deal with that hatred. But if you let it build up inside, it might explode, perhaps into taking vengeance on them. But no matter what, all of these things are destructive to relationships. And each mitzvah covers a different kind of hatred. One thing that we didn't analyze here, and I'll take a moment before we pause for questions, is about vengeance. Now, it does say here, There's a specific mitzvah not to take vengeance and not to bear a grudge. What we're going to do now for the rest of class is talk about, is there ever a time when hatred is appropriate? And the reason we're not going to talk about vengeance is because, as Rav Jonathan Sachs Zatzal, in a beautiful piece that he wrote, is quite clear, vengeance is never permitted except for if Hashem gives a specific mitzvah to commit vengeance. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Elizabeth, but every year there's one Shabbos where we go to shul where we're supposed to hear a special parsha where God asks us to take vengeance on a people. Do you remember off the top of your head? Starts with an A.
The Amalekites.
Shmamashmek. What?
The Amalekites.
Amalek. So, and Rav Sachs is very clear that it's never permitted to take vengeance unless Hashem specifically commands it. Hate, we'll see, is much more nuanced, but vengeance is never permitted. Now, there is something that if there's two people and person A kills someone, that person's brothers, the murdered person's brothers, have a right to chase down the murderer and kill them scot-free. So that's why the Torah has cities of refuge where they're safe. But it doesn't give them permission to kill the person. It just says that there's no penalty for it. But again, the Torah never permits vengeance except for specific exceptions where God permits it. Hatred, as we'll see, is much more complicated. So before we go on to the next source, are there any questions up until now? Excellent. So Tamar, I'm going to unmute you. And this next source here that'll kind of round out this first section of really understanding the basic mitzvot. And what we've really seen so far, all we've seen is don't ever hate. We haven't seen the nuances. Just don't hate really bad. So if you'll take this short piece from Shimshon Raphael Hirsch from his commentary on the verse of Vayikra, please.
The assumption in this prohibition is that our brother's misbehavior towards us is liable to provoke hatred in our hearts. Such feelings are only natural in the heart, not sensitized by the Torah, but they must not arise in our hearts. Even if our brother has done us many wrongs, he always remains our brother. After all, we are all God's children, and we are all soon together, joined in brotherhood to each other through God. We are brothers, the children of one Father, and for the sake of this one Father, who still calls him his son and reserves for him a place in his house and in his heart, hatred must not arise in our hearts. Again, there is nothing as effective to removing hate from the heart as the idea implicit in the word achicha. Every man is a brother in God's house, in our Father's house. There is no place for hate arising out of jealousy.
Thank you very much, Tamar. So one of the things that Rav Hirsch beautifully did here is emphasize the significance of the brotherhood, is that it makes sense. People, unless somebody's a perfect righteous person, which we'll actually come back to that idea, unless somebody is perfect, it's really hard not to hate people for what they do to us. And the Torah is saying that despite that, you still have to not bear hatred for others. So again, really emphasizing that you just really can't ever actively hate someone. It's so destructive. But one of the things that might help with that, other than being a perfectly righteous, which no one is to remember everybody's family. Now, that doesn't mean families don't fight, but ideally, and again, obviously there are plenty of families that unfortunately do bear hatred, but there's something special about family. They say blood is thicker than water, or I think that's it. But, family is so powerful that it should really surpass any hatred. And another beautiful thing he does here is he doesn't just say Jews, because a question that may have arisen in your minds, especially after Sefer HaChinuch, is, well, it looks like we can't hate a fellow Jew, but we can certainly hate non-Jews, or at least we're allowed to. And here Rav Hirsch says, no. We are all the children of God, not just Jews. We are all one big family. God is the father of us all. And do we really want to bring hatred into God's house? So when we think, God, I hate that person, and it's much easier to hate a stranger who you've never met. But as soon as you remember, they're a person just like you. And even in a distant way, we're all in this boat together. It's much harder to hate somebody that you know. And I think that's an important thing just for in general for life. It's really hard to hate somebody you know. It's easy to hate some television personality you've never met. But as soon as you meet someone as a human being, it's much harder to bear baseless hatred for them. So before we go on to the next section, any questions until now? Excellent. Rita, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this next section here is where things start to get complicated. So if one reads the Torah, other than a few exceptions where God says, take vengeance, and a few verses that we'll see where God does talk about hate for certain groups of people, other than that, the Torah is pretty explicit, no hatred, no vengeance. You actively should, not even no hatred, you should actively show love and treat others the way that you wish they would treat you. But then we come to this very famous source in the Talmud that complicates things. So Rita, if you would please take the source from Psachim 113b, and I didn't bring it because Pesach is coming next week. It just happens to be where the source is. So please, Rita, Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak.
Yitzchak said that Rav said, although one who sees in our committing a sin should not testify against him by himself, he is nonetheless permitted to hate him, as it is stated, if you see the donkey or he who hates you lying under its load. Exodus 23:5. The Gemara clarifies this verse. What is the meaning of he who hates you mentioned in the verse? If you say it is referring to a Gentile who hates you, but wasn't it taught in Baraisa that the phrase he who hates, of which the Torah spoke, is a Jew who hates you, not a Gentile who hates you?
Pause there for a moment at the word rather. So the context going into this is if a Jew sees another Jew sinning, and depending on the sin, there might be capital punishment or some other kind of punishment. And again, a really evil one, let's say avodah zarah, idolatry. Now, if no one else is there, my lone testimony, I as one person, can't really do anything. There needs to be two witnesses and their testimony needs to be perfect to be able to call that evildoer. And again, idolatry is really, if not the worst evil, it's in the top two of most evil things in the Torah. It probably is number one. But I, as a single witness, can't do anything. So this source is implying that I can't do anything in court, but I can actively hate them. Whoa. But I thought we're not allowed to hate. But then there's another mitzvah that says, if you see the donkey, basically the animal, as someone you hate, nevertheless, even though you hate them, you still must help them. However, that's not what we care about. The Torah is implying that you are allowed to hate people. You can't not help their animals, because what if their animals haven't done anything wrong, but you can still hate them? So the first explanation is, no. We're talking here about a non-Jew. And again, that's where that troubling idea that Rav Hirsch quashes, the idea that we can't hate a fellow Jew, but we can hate non-Jews. And here it says, no. This has nothing to do with non-Jews. We're not allowed to hate them. This is specifically about a fellow Jew. And it's implying that we can hate a fellow Jew. What do we do with that? So the rather is basically saying what I just said, is that source is clearly referring in this explanation to hating a fellow Jew, which again is really troubling based on everything we've seen so far. So Rita, please continue. Rather, it is obvious.
Rather, it is obvious that the verse is referring to a Jew who hates you. But is one permitted to hate a fellow Jew? But isn't it written, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, Leviticus 19:17, which clearly prohibits the hatred of another Jew? Rather, perhaps you will say that the verse is referring to a situation there are witnesses what he performed a sin. However, in this case, everyone else should also hate him.
But sorry, pause there for one more moment. So they're trying to deal with this fact that we have a clear mitzvah from the Torah to not hate, but then we have this clear tradition that, again, if there's nothing I can do to the idolater in court, then I can actively hate them. How do we deal with that? And what they're saying is, and that's the thrust of the rest of the class, is maybe there are exceptions when we can hate. So what this is saying is the Torah says you can't hate unless somebody who does something truly evil, like idolatry or murder, and I can't do anything in court. Ideally, I wouldn't have hate. I would testify and let God's system give them a punishment, and then I'm done with it. And it's not about hatred, it's fulfilling God's commandments. But when I can't do that, then I'm allowed to hate them. And that's the best that I can do, is actively hate them. And somehow that makes up for the fact that, you know, they're not going to court and they're getting off scot-free. And the Talmud says, if that's okay, then really everyone should be able to hate them, not just the person who testified. We should just be able to hate all idolaters and all evil people who were acquitted in court. And obviously, we know today there's a lot of political conversation around that, about people who are acquitted, who don't go to trial, and then some people despise them and destroy their lives anyway. So this conversation is actually quite relevant today, but the Talmud is still uncomfortable with that. And also, that's not a good answer, because they're trying to limit the conversation. If we can hate all idolaters and all sinners, then why is the Torah bothering to tell us do not hate? So what can it mean? So they continue, please.
What is different about this particular person who hates him? Rather, it is not referring to a case like this, then he saw him perform a licentious matter. He is therefore permitted to hate him for his evil behavior, whereas others who are unaware of his action may not hate him. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, not only it is permitted, it is even a mitzvah to hate him, as it is stated, the fear of God is to hate evil.
And this is the end of the conversation. So this is the boom moment to, is it permitted to hate? And again, to repeat, a Jew sees another Jew sinning, and again, in an egregious manner. There are two options. Ideally, two Jews would see him and they take him to trial, and he would get an appropriate punishment. His soul would be, you know, there would be kapara, atonement for his sins, and they wouldn't have to bear hatred. That's ideal. But in the not ideal situation, the person who saw him is allowed to bear hatred, but only the one who saw him. And that's the end of the conversation. And then they even bring in a verse, and the book of Proverbs, Mishlei, is not as powerful as the Torah, but it certainly sets up certain values. And it's clear to them that there is a value and a certain situation where someone's evil behavior, I'm looking over here if they have the clear language for it. I don't see it, but we'll see it later. But somebody who is just evil, that you can just hate them if they are truly evil. And what we have to do is unpack that and say, is that really true? Are there times when we can really hate people? And how do we gel that? How do we make that work with the Torah's clear, multi-stated values, mitzvot, of not hating and actively loving? And there are actually two more sources here that also imply that hatred can be permitted at times. So Alan, oh, you still there? Yes. Alan, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you just want to click on your side. And if you would please read for us this other source from the Talmud Bavli and Ta'anit, every person.
Every person who is arrogant may be called an evildoer, as it says, the arrogant man can be called an evildoer in his face. Rav Nachman, the son of Yitzchak, says, you are allowed to hate him, the arrogant one, as it says, and the arrogant of face shall change. Do not read shall change, yeshuneh, but shall be hated, yisaneh.
And that's a typical drash interpretation of the rabbis, where they find a verse that seems to, at least it discusses the topic at hand, i.e. those who are arrogant and their behavior is very inappropriate and will lead often to sinning or idolatry. And there it talks about, you know, we want to change their behavior, which we will come back to. But the way they're interpreting it here is not that we want them to change for the better, but rather we can actively hate them. We don't have to delve too much more into the source. Again, it's just there. It's not just one time in the Talmud that it's clearly implied. And by the way, here, our person again is Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, above in the previous source, and again here in a different book of the Talmud, Ta'anit, dealing with fast. Again, it's Rav Nachman, son of, or bar Yitzchak. So it's the same rabbi. So he's consistent. So he was going around and just, you know, flipping everybody off and honking at them in the car and stuff like that. But he is consistent in his theology that there are people who it is permitted to hate. And now we go back to that anonymous 13th century Spanish work, Sefer HaChinuch, and Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And he is going to now echo And again, he talked about in the context of the mitzvah, 238, do not hate. This is what he has to say, please.
Every person who is arrogant may be.
Oh, sorry, the next source, Gloria, source number 3, separate, but there is no prohibition.
There is no prohibition in the hatred of evildoers, but rather it is a commandment to hate them. After we rebuke them about their sin many times, and they do not want to return, as it is stated, do I not, Lord, hate your enemies and argue with those that come against you?
Thank you. So now we bring another verse. Again, it's from the book of Psalms to Tehillim, but it certainly implies that there are those who it's permitted to hate. And the Sefer HaChinuch, which is based on the Rambam, Maimonides' list of mitzvot, has a certain amount of authority. It's a very, very important work that's studied. And in the context of the mitzvah, do not hate, it says, but that law of do not hate, it doesn't apply to those who are truly evildoers, Reshaim, the wicked ones. So if we stopped here, it would be quite clear that the mitzvah of do not hate doesn't apply to everybody. We can actively hate people. And what we're going to see is it's not a clear cut where the rabbis say, no, we all disagree with this or we all agree with this. We're going to see 2 different ways to approach this. In some ways, 3 different ways, because they get very, very nuanced in what it means to hate someone. But so far, what we've seen is despite the Torah being quite explicit about do not hate, the rabbinic tradition is very clear that there is an exception to that. How big is that exception? Who can that hatred go against? We'll unpack some of that in a moment. But again, I'll pause here for a sec and see if there are any questions, thoughts, or comments up until now. Beautiful. So Leonard, oh yeah. Anna, go ahead. Adjust. Just have to unclick on your side. Go for it.
Okay. I had a question about
Please.
the one witness,
Yes.
and I'm wondering if the witness were to say, hey, that's not right to do, and the person were to repent without being brought to trial. Is there anything about that?
So the answer is absolutely yes. You have preempted pretty much the most important part of the class. That's not a bad thing. But essentially the question here is, what's the point? Ultimately, the Torah says we really don't want to hate. Ultimately it's destructive, but there's an exception to this rule. And they're saying it's a case where someone can't be brought to justice. So what's the purpose of the hatred then? If the Torah is opposed to us hating, and ideally we bring someone to justice, then why would we be allowed in certain situations to hate? And maybe it's not hatred for hatred's sake. Maybe it's towards an end. And that's exactly what we're going to come to in section D, I believe. So I don't want to give it all away, but excellent. You hit the nail on the head there. So before we go on to, again, what's the point of this hatred? Because baseless hatred is what the rabbis, I didn't bring the source here, but the rabbis talk about sinat chinam. I think chinam is usually like free, if there's like free mints at a restaurant, but sinat chinam is translated as baseless hatred. Hatred for no reason whatsoever is what the rabbis say destroyed the Second Temple. And the truth is the infighting between the different factions around the time of the Romans really was baseless hatred. It was more a civil war that caused us to be destroyed than the Roman overlords, as it were. We really brought it on ourselves. But if our tradition does allow for hatred in certain cases, it must not be baseless. There must be a reason for it. So before we get to that, we're going to look here, Leonard, and I'll have you take this first source about why is hatred so bad besides the obvious things we talked about. And again, we see the Sefer HaChinuch here because again, it's in English. If you ever just want to get a really good overview of the mitzvot and what they look like and why they are, the Sefer HaChinuch is just one of the most beautiful books ever written. And again, we don't know who the author is, but it was probably written from a father for his son to study, which is beautiful in and of itself. So Leonard, if you would take source number 1 here, the shoresh of the mitzvah, what's the root of it? What's the reason for no hating, please?
The root of the commandment is well known, as hatred of the heart causes great evils among people, being a constant sword between a man and his brother, and a man and his neighbor. It is a cause for all of us, for all of the informing that is done. And it is slowly and completely disgusting a trait among all people of intellect.
Excellent, thank you. So you can see some of the language, sword here, so implying the actual killing is another powerful word. He talks about informing Moser, and this was a terrible thing that has happened throughout Jewish history, where Jews would basically go to the non-Jewish authorities and say, oh, my neighbor said something bad about the king, or he's a thief, and knowing that the non-Jewish rulers at that time wouldn't give the person a fair trial. They would just throw them in jail or kill them. So informants on fellow Jews is one of the worst, most hateful mitzvot. And today it's actually very relevant because we talk about in certain very close-knit cloistered communities where Jews do horrible things, sexually inappropriate things, pedophilia, et cetera, like that. And they say, oh, because we're not allowed to inform on others, we're not going to say anything about it. So most rabbis pretty much all say that's an exception to it. But here people are informing on each other because they're mad about, he ripped me off in the store, or I just don't like the way he looks at me. But this hatred can lead to death. It can lead to the worst awful things in the world. It leads to civil wars. It is so utterly destructive. It can destroy all of society. It is disgusting. And there's really no rational reason to hate each other to this level. So again, we don't even need to go to Jewish sources. You could just Google why is hatred bad, and you'd probably have a billion hits, and they'd all consistently say how destructive and dangerous, not only to others, but what it does to us. A person who lives a life full of hate, it just destroys them, their relationships, spiritually, psychologically. It is the most damaging, other than anger, and they're often connected, it's one of the most damaging things human beings can do is hate. And this next source here, relatively contemporary, Rav Tzvi Yehuda HaKohen Kook and his father, the great Rav Kook was the first chief rabbi of British Mandate Palestine before it was the modern country of Israel. And his son, also a great Rav in his time, wrote several beautiful works, including one, Lenetivot Yisrael. And he talked here about why it's so bad to hate other people, and specifically, not just hatred in general, but hatred of other Jews who are not observant. Because in the Orthodox world, unfortunately, this is all too common. Non-observant Jews, there's a certain resentment of and often a hatred of. And not only is hatred in general damaging, but it also does, they may think it's constructive, but it's really not. It's only destructive. So let's see, where are we up to now? And Lindsay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would please take the source from Rav Tzvi Yehuda HaKohen Kook. And just sorry, the first word there, Tosafot, it's a famous medieval, it's a whole school, it's like dozens of rabbis commented on the Talmud, and there was a source where they actually talked about when hatred is permitted. And the only reason I didn't bring it is because it's kind of covered in some later sources. However, he uses it as a jumping off point where they basically say there are times when hating others might be permitted, but he's talking here about ultimately it's still destructive. So please.
How did you say it? Tosafot?
Tosafot, yeah.
Give us a deep psychological insight. The verse in the book of Mishlei,
Mishlei, which is Proverbs, yeah.
Says, as a face opposite water reflects another face, so do people reflect each other's hearts. Sorry, my dog's barking.
No. He's adding some great commentary.
Yeah. If the religious fail to behave with love toward the irreligious, the latter feel hated and rejected. They sense that religious people only have love for other religious people and that they look upon the irreligious with condemnation. This situation arises from reverence for God, but the irreligious person is left dejected. This causes conflict, and the situation continues and worsens until it reaches total hatred. May God save us. The origin point is a valid response to spiritual failing. The initial hatred isn't complete, but it grows until it becomes utter abhorrence, and this is something truly awful.
Excellent, thank you so much, and thank you for being able to focus with the puppies in the background.
Sorry.
No, not at all. There are three really powerful and beautiful, at least three beautiful things in here. One is that based on the verse of Mishlei, if I hate somebody else, what is it probably going to end up doing? It's probably going to make them hate me. So hating anyone else, forget about the specific context he mentions here. When I bring hatred into the world, it's probably going to bring hatred back on me. And again, it's a very relevant thing today. When one group hates another, it's going to bring hatred on them. And it's an endless cycle. It's an endless cycle that just keeps escalating and escalating until people get hurt or worse. So hatred goes both ways. It reflects back on the person who's brings out the hate. The second thing here is that perhaps some people think about the irreligious, those who are not observant, as somebody deserving of hate. And this is one of the important things we'll talk about is if hatred is ever permitted, who's deserving of it? But the very, very Orthodox that the audience he's talking to might think, well, we hate the secular because they're sinning. And his point is that if you think hating is a good constructive thing, that God wants you to do it, think about what's going to happen. Your hatred is only going to cause them to move further away from Torah. It's only going to cause them to hate Torah more. And do you really think that's what God wants? Not that we shouldn't fight against evil, not that we shouldn't call out people who are truly wicked, but if your goal here is to serve God's Torah, how can that be served by pushing people further away from Torah by bringing hatred on them? And by the way, I imagine everyone on this call, including myself, knows somebody who says, I was mistreated, or the way that I know those Orthodox, those Frummies talked about me or treated me, it made me want nothing to do with Judaism. And there are too many examples of people who either were in the religious world or visited the religious world, and they felt so much. And again, this is not an indictment of all religious Jews. I consider myself an Orthodox Jew, but for those who think that it's their mandate to hate the non-observant, there's really no logic behind it. All it does is create more non-observance. And by the way, this is consistent with Rav Tzvi Yehuda HaKohen's Kook father, his father's view, who consistently shared the message that we should reach out to those who are non-observant and help bring them into the fold with love and understanding for their background. So like father, like son, in a very beautiful way. And the last thing here that kind of goes back to our original conversation is the whole idea here, the thing that reminds us, as Rav Hirsch said, that we shouldn't hate others because they're family. And when the religious treat others with hatred and resentment and scorn, it basically makes them think, I'm fine. If you think I'm not Jewish, either the non-observant Jews say, fine, I'm not Jewish, I want nothing to do with Judaism, or it flips around and it backfires even worse, is you Orthodox Jews, you Frummies, you're not Jewish, you're out of the fold because of the disgusting way you treat people. And again, this is not me doing a blanket indictment all of Orthodoxy, but it is far too common to have resentment between denominations, and it really does go both ways. I've heard from people in every denomination who attack the other denomination as, oh, they hate me. Well, they're the ones who really deserve to be hated. Again, it's an endless destructive cycle. So Rav Tzvi Yehuda HaKohen Kook and Netivot Yisrael captures so much of that just in a very beautiful and powerful way. So before we go on to, I believe, the final section, are there any questions up until now? Excellent. So Jeremy, I'm going to unmute you again. This source here, which I haven't brought in a lot of, but he is actually one of my favorite commentaries on the Torah, the Meshech Chochmah, Meir Simcha Dvinsk from Latvia. And this section is essentially, when is it permitted to hate? And we're kind of going to see, like I said, two, maybe three different ways about, we've seen clearly that the Torah says don't hate, and the rabbis also say clearly there are times when hatred of another may be permitted. When might that be? So Jeremy, please, from the Meshech Chochmah in his section on Ki Teitzei, so it's far away from our Parsha, but it comes up in another conversation, please.
This was said prior to the sin of the golden calf, when all of Israel was a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, from Shemot 19:6. At that point, it was permitted to hate a person who had committed a blatant sin. However, this did not remain true after Israel's repeated sinful acts. From that point onward, whenever encountering a sinner, we must examine our own conduct, which is not free of faults. One may fall short in this area, another in that area. It is therefore forbidden for anyone whose conduct is not free of all blemishes to hate another Jew, but there are very few individuals who fit that bill, as the Talmud states. I have seen eminent men, but they are few.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, before I explain the source, there's a very important concept in rabbinic thought, and that's that we do not reject earlier traditions and certainly the mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah. So the Torah certainly says do not hate, but then the Talmud says there's time that's permitted to hate, and it's very important to the rabbis that we make all of this work together, that we can't have multiple opinions, certainly nothing that rejects the Torah. So what we're at this point in history, and certainly had it before the 19th century, but basically he has the tradition of hatred is permitted at times. Yet he, and I think many on this call, are uncomfortable with that. How can we ever permit hatred? So what the rabbis often do is they either limit the permission to do something they're uncomfortable with, like for example, capital punishment is on the books, but they say we can only do capital punishment, put someone to death, when there's incontrovertible evidence. There's like 50 witnesses and they're all say the exact same thing under duress. And there's just so much evidence that, God's self couldn't, argue against the evidence. Only in that rare case, 1 in a billion, can we put someone to death. We haven't rejected capital punishment, but we've limited it. So what he does here is he says, yes, there are times when we're allowed to hate. And he says there was a point in history where active hatred, real hatred of a wicked person, like actually hating the person, was permitted, but that was only when people are at this high spiritual level, which is another rabbinic concept, that people used to be at a much higher, more pure spiritual level, the days of Abraham and before. Regardless, his point is we're not there. And there's a famous, I'm not going to mention it, but at another religion that says it quite beautifully, or a character in that religion, about we can't judge others if we have sins on our own shoulders, unless we're absolutely perfect. And we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we have no sins and that we know exactly what we're talking about. Only in that rare case can we hate, but for the rest of us, all of us, we have no right to hate others, because you know what? We all have something that is not perfect about us that would allow for others to hate us. And as long as we bear that on their shoulders, we are not worthy. We do not have the right to hate others. So he says 2 important things. Real hatred, actively hating other human beings, can be permitted when they are wicked, but the only people who are allowed to do that have to be perfectly righteous. And he doesn't say there's no one, but it's unbelievably limited. And I guarantee you, the majority, everybody out there, both in the religious Jewish world and any other world, who hate others, they have plenty of sins on their shoulders. They have plenty of reasons why they are not worthy to be the righteous individual and have that hatred for others. So again, hatred can be permitted, but very few people are allowed to do it. But now we're going to go in a different direction, which is to take the idea of hating others and not to limit it, but to reinterpret what, not how we hate, but what we actually hate. And this is a beautiful and famous story. And Elizabeth, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And where are you there? And would you please take this story from Talmud Bavli, please. Brachot.
There were those hooligans in Rabbi Meir's neighborhood who caused him a great deal of anguish. Rabbi Meir prayed for God to have mercy on them, that they should die. Rabbi Meir's wife, Beruya, said to him, "What is your thinking? On what basis do you pray for the death of these hooligans? Do you base yourself on the verse, as it is written, let the sins cease from the land, which you interpret to mean that the world would be better if the wicked were destroyed? But it is written, let sinners cease."
She posed a question, but is it written, let sinners cease?
Oh, yeah, okay. But is it written, let sinners cease? Let sin cease, it is written. One should pray for an end to their transgressions, not for the demise of the transgressors themselves.
Excellent. So Anna, this goes all the way back to your point, and this is the way we say it is, hate the sin, not the sinner. And there's many contexts about that, and a lot of people are uncomfortable with that, but that's essentially what it's saying here, is hatred, despising something, wanting that thing to be out of the world and doing anything you can to get rid of it, and it making you feel disgusting when you think of it. Never put that on a human being, because all human beings are family. All are brothers and neighbors, and we have a connection with them, but we can hate their actions. And I actually talk about that with my daughter a lot, especially today, is not about hating a person, but being angry at the choices they make. You know, I'm not going to tell my daughter there are no bad people, but really I try and help her think about people making bad choices. And that allows someone to both be open to people repenting and coming back to a good path and having better, more peaceful relations. But again, if we attack their actions, it allows for dialogue. It allows for us to see other people as humans who made a mistake. And we hate the mistake they made. We hate what they did, but we don't hate them. And that maintains the mitzvah of the Torah. The Torah says, don't hate people. So what do the mean rabbis say you can hate someone? We reinterpret it not as hate the sinners themselves, rather hate the sin. So it maintains that there is a time when hatred is permitted, but not against human beings, rather against their actions. And again, we come back to Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda HaKohen Kook, and Elizabeth, I don't know if you're still unmuted, but you can just take that short little source as well.
To every place where we find references to hatred, we understand clearly that the intent is only to oppose the phenomenon of evil and to fight the impurity of evil. It is not directed against the people. As we say, all wickedness will vanish like smoke.
Beautiful. So he's reiterating that idea from the Talmud in a very beautiful way. Is our goal here is not to wipe out sinners. Our goal here is to wipe out sin. All of the actions, everything we do should not be, or it shouldn't be, hatred is not an end in and of itself. Hatred is a tool to try and get people to change their behavior, which leads us to our final sources. And Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this source here from Rambam in his Mishnah Torah, and one of the early books in his Mishnah Torah really talks about how to live, how to live your life, not about what's kosher and what's permitted, etc., but just how to live in this world and be a good, righteous individual. So please, Gloria, there are temperaments.
There are temperaments with regard to which a man is forbidden to follow the middle path. He should move away from one extreme and adopt the other. Anger is also an exceptionally bad quality. It is fitting and proper that one move away from it and adopt the opposite extreme. He should school himself not to become angry, even when it is fitting to be angry. If he should wish to arouse fear in his children and household, or within the community, if he is a communal leader, and wishes to be angry at them to motivate them to return to the proper path, he should present an angry front to them to punish them. But he should be inwardly calm. He should be like one who acts out the part of an angry man in his wrath, but is not himself angry.
Thank you. So while it doesn't talk about hatred here, I think this is very, very deeply connected to our whole conversation, because ultimately it's saying these negative emotions that we have towards anger, which almost always leads to hate, there is a place for it, but not as a feeling, an emotion we feel towards other, but rather as a tool to try and get them to change their behavior, snubbing somebody, acting angry. And any parent knows that there are times when they have to act angry when internally they might be laughing that their kid did something ridiculous, but they know that that behavior is not appropriate. Or they might actually feel angry, but they know that they don't want to scream at their kids because they don't want to hurt them and make them cry, but they know, for example, if a kid is about to run out in the middle of the street, that if their mother doesn't yell at them and show some real fear of God into them, they might do it again. I will tell you, I ran out into the street once in my entire life. I never, ever, ever did it again because my mother is an incredible woman. So next time you see her, be like, oh, I heard you were angry at your son when he was 4 years old, and she'll just be very confused. But that's the first thing there, is that emotion. But the other thing he says here, which is very powerful, is he talks about internally in our hearts to not feel anger. And if we remember back to the Sefer HaChinuch, he said hatred should not be something you have inside, but it also said not to act on it. So how is this okay? So when we talk about acting on hatred, that turns into being vengeful, which we said is never permitted. And what's interesting is the example that Rashi and other rabbis give for vengeance is, I lend my shovel to somebody, and then somebody, I lend my shovel to somebody, and then they don't give it back to me, and I'm really resentful and mad they didn't give it back, and then they go to me the next week or a few months later, it's like, oh, can I borrow a hammer from you? And if I'm angry and hateful and I want to be spiteful, I say, no, I'm mad at you because you didn't give back my shovel. And that's very human. We do that not all of us, but it's a very common thing to do. And what it's saying is, don't do that. Don't act against people in a spiteful way. This is not that. This is me using an emotion to show somebody how displeased I am with their behavior. And this also goes to the conversation about shaming someone versus making them feel guilty about their actions. We don't hurt a person just to hurt them. We try and let a person know that their actions are unacceptable and they need to change what they're doing. That is permitted. Hating them and being resentful for no reason other than we're angry, which again is a human emotion, that's not permitted. And that idea is actually represented here in a beautiful way. And I'll just take these last two sources. So in Sefer Dvarim, it's going over the laws of certain kinds of punishment, corporal punishment, whipping someone, which is a step below killing them, as a way to not hurt them for hurting's sake, but as a aggressive, violent tool so that they won't sin anymore. So I only brought a few words because that's all we need for the Talmud. So it says if the guilty one, the Rasha, the wicked one, is to be flogged, whipped, he may be given up to 40 lashes, such as the law, up to 40 and no more, because once 40, it's basically a death sentence, but not more, lest your brother be degraded before your eyes. And what the Talmud is going to pick up is it starts by saying the wicked one, the Rasha, and then it turns to talking about your brother. So where's that shift come in? So in the Talmud, in the section of Makot, which literally means the whipping, in the section about certain punishment, it says, and your brother shall be debased before your eyes, denigrated, lowered, nikla, takala, like cursed before your eyes, indicating once he is flogged, or after they are flogged, they are your brother, as his sin has been atoned and he is no longer excised from the Jewish people. In other words, true hatred, the hatred forbidden by the Torah, is we just see people, the person, as a wicked monster, and they're just to be hated. However, the orientation that we should approach is their actions are sinful and destructive. However, the person underneath is our brother, is our family, someone who deserves to be saved, someone who deserves to be helped. And it's very challenging today in this climate to see people that it's very easy to hate, and to remember that they are making horrible decisions. They are deeply misguided, but they're still our brothers. And that doesn't mean we let them off the hook. One thing we didn't go to so much into depth is back to that original mitzvah from the verses about rebuke. There is a command to actively go out there and to try and change people's behavior. So we do not have to accept anti-Semites or fascists or neo-Nazis. What they are doing is beyond reproach. It is evil. We must actively fight against what they're doing. But our goal is not to destroy them. Our goal is to try to save them. And the rabbis say, if they're not going to listen to us, then don't talk, because it might just, as Rav Kook was saying, or Rav Kook's son was saying, if we try and actively argue with these neo-Nazis and these horrible people and these white supremacists, it might just make them hate us more. So that's one of the challenges. We have to actively fight against evil for people who might actually be willing and open to us. But even if we're not going to go in a conversation with them, our orientation should not be, these are not people and they just deserve to be killed. Our orientation should be, they've made all the bad choices. What they're doing is beyond evil. They need to be stopped. There's nothing okay at all about their actions, but they're still human beings. And if there's a way to save them, then we must do so. And the Torah ultimately implies that, is we do everything we can to save a person, up to and including ending their life. If there's somebody who is so destructive in this world that they can't be saved through kindness, through rebuke tochacha, through even being whipped, and the only way to stop their sinful behavior is to end their life, even though we don't like that, the whole point is, the goal is not to kill them or hurt them. The goal is to save them. Not everyone can be saved, but the point is this: why do we even care about saving these evil, disgusting people? Because they're people. They may be great sinners, but they're still humans who are sinning. And that doesn't mean that we can't have anger at what they do, but we still need to remember that everyone deserves a chance as much as is possible. And that is how the rabbis took the idea of don't hate humans, but you can absolutely hate and actively try and stamp out the evil, wicked things that they